What's going on, guys? Sharpshot here. Hope you guys are having a great day so far. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at DBD's DC penalty and answering whether or not it should be in the game. With DBD removing the DC penalty during the 50-year event and then re-adding it a little bit ago, it sparked a lot of debate on whether the DC penalty should actually be in the game or not. And I thought it'd be a good idea to talk more about it and give my thoughts on whether I think the DC penalty should be in the game or not. So in this video, I'm going to be looking on both sides of the argument. I'm going to be listing 3 arguments as to why there should be a DC penalty, and then 3 arguments why there shouldn't be a DC penalty. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to be giving my thoughts on whether I think there should be a DC penalty or not. So yeah, without further ado, let's get right into the video. So before we actually get into the arguments, I just want to explain to you guys what the DC penalty actually is. So as it stands, if a player disconnects from the match, whether it be from the game crashing or they rage quit, whatever it may be, if they disconnect from the match, they won't be able to join a new match or start a new match for a predetermined length of time, and that length of time increases per DC. So for example, on your first DC, it might be 5 minutes, I think, and then if you DC another time, the time it takes for you to get into another game will increase to 10 minutes, 30 minutes, or whatever it may be. And the game in which that player DC'd from, they get no pips from that game. So depending on the rank they were at, they might rank down and depip from that game, and they also get no blood points or XP from that match. So now that you know what the DC penalty is, I'm not going to look at why there should be a DC penalty in DBD. The main argument for having DC penalty is that it keeps the majority of the people playing in game and in the trial. By the majority, I mean the people who do not want a penalty from DCing. Obviously, there's going to be a minority of people who don't care about their rank and don't care about the penalty and will DC anyways, regardless of if there's a penalty or not. Having the majority of the people stay in game will keep the game more consistent and will keep the game more fair and have a better player experience for the killers and survivors playing in the trial. Because having a survivor DC really skews the game for the killer, and having the killer DC ends the game straight up, so it's not fair for either side. The second argument is that if there wasn't a DC penalty, as you saw in the 50-year event, so many people were DCing for minor inconveniences that shouldn't even warrant a DC in the first place. Examples of these unwarranted DCs were if you were playing on a really bad map, if you were playing against a really good killer, if you were playing against really toxic gameplay like face camping or tunneling or body blocking and all sorts of that stuff. There's another argument for having toxicity being warranted as a DC, but at the end of the day, I personally think that tunneling and face camping, as shitty as it is to play, is really part of the game. It's the way the killer chooses to play the game, it's the way the survivor chooses to play the game, and I don't really think that warrants a DC. I think that you should just keep playing the game because not every game is going to have toxic people. In the example of having a really good killer, having no DC penalty would ruin the playing experience for them, because if survivors just DCing with no penalty just because the killer is really good, it makes it so that the killer will never be able to play an actual full game because there's always going to be someone DCing because they're frustrated at how good the killer is. And on the survivor side of things, for the people who don't want to DC ever, it'll make it so that they'll never be able to play a fair game on a bad map, for example, against a really good killer. They'll only be able to play a full and fair game whenever the advantage is on the survivor side, because if the survivors are disadvantaged, it'll mean that there's always going to be a survivor DCing from the match. Survivors who don't want to DC will never be able to play disadvantage, which honestly is something fun about the game. Having those games against really good killers on really bad maps sometimes is pretty fun because it poses a challenge for the survivor to fight through. The third argument is that DCing hurts everybody in the game, survivors and killers included. Obviously, if the killer DCs, the game just ends, which ruins it for the survivors who are trying to get as many blood points as possible or trying to rank up as much as possible. That'll get cut short if the game gets cut short, so that ruins the experience for them. And if a survivor DCs, this ruins the game for both the killer and the survivor. This hurts the survivors because it gives them less of a chance to actually escape, and it indirectly affects their pips and their blood points and their score, because having a teammate DC means that they'll get less points because they'll have a lesser chance of surviving and have a lesser chance of doing good in the game and doing gens and stuff like that because they're down one person. This ruins it for the killer because they won't be able to have a full game and get as many blood points and pips as possible. For example, if someone is going for an adept and a survivor DCs, that killer won't be able to get that double pip anymore because they didn't get all the hooks out of that person. So in that scenario, whoever DCs, whether it be a survivor or a killer, should be punished for that because that DC ruined the game for the survivor or the killer or everybody. Moving on to why there shouldn't be a DC penalty, the main argument for this is that there shouldn't be a DC penalty when someone's game crashes or their Wi-Fi lags out or something like that, because this is something something that you can't control whatsoever. So if your game crashes and you get penalized for that, it just ruins the experience and it's just not fun at all. The second argument for having no DC penalty is that it allows you to actually disconnect and leave the match for really unfun and toxic scenarios, or maybe even glitchy scenarios that you wouldn't have wanted to DC in with an actual penalty. At the end of the day, people play DBD just to have fun, so being forced to play in a really bad situation for 10 or 20 minutes or whatever time it may be just to have no penalty for your rank or your score makes the game really not fun. So for example, if you get camped for 10 minutes game after game after game, the game is going to become really boring and not fun at all. So having no DC penalty would allow you to leave the game from that scenario and just get into a game until you have a good time and actually have fun playing DBD in a fair match. A third argument for having no DC penalty is that it will teach a lesson and actually phase out the toxicity in game on both the survivor side and the killer side. The argument for this is that if everybody DCs with a toxic scenario, whether that be a killer face camping or that same survivor is constantly sandbagging every single game and people always DC in their game, this will teach those toxic people a lesson to not be toxic anymore. For example, if a toxic killer is face camping every single game and the survivors always DC with no penalty 5 minutes into the game, the killer will have no games to play because all the survivors will DC every single time, and then the killer will probably realize after a while, oh man, I shouldn't face camp anymore because I can't even play a full game anymore, and they'll stop doing that. And on the survivor side of things, if they're being really toxic and sandbagging or not playing right, and they see that all their teammates are constantly DCing because of how they're playing, they're probably going to stop that too. Now I'm going to move on to my thoughts on what I think they should do with the DC penalty. So I think there should be a DC penalty in Dead by Daylight, but not the one that's currently in the game. I think that having no DC penalty is a disaster in game. When I was playing in the 50-year event, people were constantly DCing in my survivor games almost every single game, and there were some games that were so bad that all 3 of my teammates were DCing and I was just left alone against the killer. And on the flip side of things, I was playing killer and trying to get adepts, and having survivors constantly DC was not allowing me to get the adepts because I wasn't getting the full hooks out of those DCing survivors. So it was ruining the fun on both sides of things, survivor and killer. And having people DC because they have a minor inconvenience in game or something's not going their way makes for a really negative and unfun experience for everybody. So I think they should definitely be punished for that. But with that being said, I think the biggest problem with the DC penalty currently in the game is that if someone DCs from the game because of their lag or the game crashes or something like that out of their control, they still get punished for that. I think that is terrible. I don't think the game crashing should warrant someone getting depipped and banned from playing for like 5 minutes. I think it ruins the gaming experience for someone who might not have the best Wi-Fi ever. So with that being said, I think the only change that DBD should make with the DC penalty is that if someone DCs, whether it be if their game crashed or they just rage quit and left the game on their own, I think they should have the option to rejoin the game for 2 minutes and not get any penalty. And if they don't join back in those 2 minutes, that's when they would get punished and get the penalty that you currently get for DCing. This would help the people whose game crashed or they disconnected from the game out of their control not get an undeserved penalty. That 2 minutes would give them more than enough time to load DBD back up and rejoin the trial. And I guarantee you, most of the people who got their game crashed, 90% of them would rejoin the game again and it would be a fair trial again. And this would also help the people who manually left the game or rage quit get a second chance to rejoin the game again. Some people regret rage quitting after they do it and it was just an impulse rage quit, so those people would be able to join the game back. So overall, it would just minimize the negative impact that DCing has on your teammates or the killer. Some people might be wondering what would happen if the killer DC'd. The 2 minutes would still apply to them. The trial would pause for 2 minutes and there would be a countdown, and if the killer joins back in those 2 minutes, then the game just resumes. And if they don't join back, that's when the killer would get the DC penalty and the survivors would just leave the game. So yeah guys, those are my thoughts on whether there should be a DC penalty or not in Dead by Daylight. Let me know in the comments whether you think there should or shouldn't be a DC penalty in DBD. Just keep the comment section civil and peaceful, please. So yeah guys, that's been the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave a like and subscribe if you're new. This has been Sharpshot, and I will see you guys in the next video.